probably more.
Okay, we like to start on time, so thanks for coming out today on this whatever kind of February day. Some quick three announcements. The first one is next week, Sunday night, but by Monday, Gary Livecap will be here. He's going to give the Vincent and Eleanor Memorial Lecture on Wednesday, but he'll also present a paper at the Colloquium here. Allison will send that out this afternoon. He'll have lots of time in his schedule to meet with graduate students and faculty, so I encourage you to take that opportunity. That's why we bring these people in over a series of days. The memorial lecture will be on Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the law school, so that I encourage you to attend that. I also want to encourage more of you to attend the Wednesday presentations. This Wednesday, it's Tom Nunnenmacher, who's a visiting scholar who will be arriving today. Tom is a co-author with Bernardo and me on a new book that we're working on institutions and organizations. He's going to present a chapter 2 on institutions and property rights, and trying to really clarify what we mean by those concepts, which are oftentimes used not very precisely. So that paper is on our website. The third is I'd like to welcome Dean Luke here, who's meeting with people and looking for a house. He, in July 1, will become the new director of our program on governance of natural resources. So that was a real coup for us, and we're really glad to have Dean here. And we've got Barb Cherry here today. She knows the rules. We just open it up. So Barb gets a few minutes to clarify.
Yes, just to set the context for this a little bit. Believe it or not, the origins of these questions go back to my dissertation, which is, I can't believe it, 20 years ago now. And when I discovered unexpectedly, this was during a period of an earlier phase of the deregulatory period in telecommunications, and I had come from industry. And when I went to academia, I was wanted to dig deeper into understanding some of the key legal concepts that were underlying the bodies of law that regulate telecommunications. And telecommunications carriers have been both common carriers and public utilities. And those are two different bodies of law. I found when I was doing my dissertation that these bodies of law have come to be misunderstood by lawyers, social scientists, to the point where even as of 20 years ago, much of the secondary literature was actually factually wrong. And a lot of policy decisions were being made based on a false understanding of what these legal principles were, what their origins were, what their reason for being is. Over the past 20 years, these errors keep having effects on policy debates over time. The most recent one is related to net neutrality, where this debate over whether or not a telecommunication or whether broadband access to the internet is a telecommunication service or not, which under federal law is a common carriage service, has been conflated with a debate about, well, is it a public utility or not? And people have been equating common carriage to public utility, which is wrong. And then what I found was, on top of it, even what a lawyer knows a public utility to be is different from how an economist thinks about it. So we also have interdisciplinary problem because the same vocabulary does not mean the same thing to these different disciplines. And each one doesn't understand the other enough, unless you happen to be trained in both, to know that you're not even talking about the same thing. Then you have it bolstered by the media, where we have a lot of the media, the popularity of the debate, where they get even more sloppy about characterizing what people are saying, and we just have a whole lot of confusion that's going in the debate, and we're not really getting to the merits, or it's very difficult to get to the merits. My body of research has moved over time in various fora. I briefly mentioned here that one of the key differences I found was, notwithstanding the common legal history of Canada and the United States, the degree of confusion over these terms is much greater in the United States than Canada. I recently published a paper that helps explain why. Also, I was able to personally help that along because I was used as an expert witness up in Canada to help clarify the true meaning of the terms, which then got me into thinking, why is it so difficult to get the lawyers and the economists to accurately understand these bodies of law and have a more factually based, empirically accurate debate about this? And so it probed me to dig deeper. This paper is my first attempt to dig deeper into some of the important constructs that underlie some key legal principles on the one hand and how economists look at it at the other. And what I discovered, I also was in a law and economics program when I was at Harvard, so I've been trained in both. And I found that I had to go back to Alfred Kahn's work. And Alfred Kahn is a regulatory economist who's been extremely influential in policy debates, but also in the development of economists. So when you even look at PhD dissertations, he's cited everywhere in Monopoly, so on and so forth. And when I went back to his famous book, The Economics of Regulation, what I found was that I was looking at his characterization of legal cases, he's wrong. He misinterprets key legal cases and builds a whole other construct of what he calls a public utility that is not the same at all of what legally it is. And he infuses his view of what a public utility is with natural monopoly and all these other concepts. So it gets to the point now, what's happened is we've developed what I've called a false monopoly theory argument. We now believe, or it's become almost like religion, for both some lawyers and economists, to think that the legal basis of being a common carrier or public utility under our laws in the United States are based on being a natural monopoly, and it's absolutely hysterical. It's hysterical now. It's historically, factually, empirically false. But it dominates the discourse still today. And even today, when we look at net neutrality, every time when the FCC, they were talking about the story that the FCC is going to reclassify telecom service as a common carriage service, the press would say that is as a public utility. That added clause right there is just wrong. And so when you go to Washington, what I found, we've got FCC commissioners who don't have it straight. We have a lot of policymakers in Congress who don't have it straight. We have state policymakers who don't have it straight. And of course, the confusion in academia itself and the literature writing is only feeding this misunderstanding. And so we are still having difficulty getting people to actually talk about what the true origins of these bodies of law are, where they came from, what was their purpose, and to what degree do those purposes still apply today. And this is where we find that the social characteristics of the service are critical. Economic characteristics are important, but that's not the dominant feature. And that's the part that's gotten lost. So this paper is just my first attempt to try and juxtapose the two more directly in terms of actually looking at Kahn, because Kahn's work, if you can understand, it's almost, in this area, it's almost like the original error in terms of how it's affecting the regulatory debate. So that's why I went back to Kahn. And I have colleagues at economists at other universities who went in this debate, and I actually went to a colleague's PhD dissertation, about 400 pages on natural monopoly, a couple decades ago. And again, sites all over the place. And again, all these confusions about the body of law are embedded in there. So what I'm trying to do is help correct. I didn't realize 20 years ago when I did my dissertation it would take this long. I thought, oh, I discovered this will be great. I was naive. Okay. But when I'm finding one way or another, we're still dealing with these errors. And so I'm certainly open to feedback, reaction, whatever. Like, again, this was my first attempt at this particular piece of the puzzle, put it down. So any questions, feedback, comments, please.
I'm going to invite you to expand on that a little bit from
Sure.
a particular perspective. And when I read this, and even more when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, so is this a theological debate? And that is, does it really matter
Yes.
how we describe this? And I can think of two reasons it might, and I'm wondering which one is the more important. The first
Yes.
reason it might matter is because as a legal matter, you're only allowed to use certain approaches under certain circumstances, and so it matters whether or not you classify this as a monopoly or not. If you classify it as a monopoly, and therefore, if you require monopoly and go, but this isn't, and take it out, then you can't regulate or something like that. But the other is just a basic conception. Take the law away and say, how would we like to regulate this, or what would we do to fix the underlying problem, ignoring the law just as a policy matter. And you see the difference between those two.
Yes, and that's why
which one you're trying to address, or is it both? People both get the basic concept wrong, and then they get the law wrong.
It's both.
Let me add to Ken, actually, because I think you need to. I think Ken's way of going about it would be help to clear the air, and pedagogically, I think, would give you some purchase. But something you don't address, and one of the biggest myths, which economic historians have addressed, which you don't cite, actually. So you go to Con, but you don't go to LiveCap, who's coming next week. Mm-hmm. You don't go to Weingast, who looked at the Interstate Commerce Act. So that most of these so-called anti-monopoly acts were not pro-consumer at all. The Meat Inspection Act was all about protecting small local butchers and going after the big producers in Chicago and elsewhere. And so time and again, the Interstate Commerce Act, for example, was a redistributive act. It wasn't, it hurt some farmers and helped some other farmers. So we think of these things from an economist intermediate micro perspective when we get up at the chalkboard and talk about why monopoly's bad because the price is too high and the quantity's too low. Sure, but factually, when we go back, the consumer benefited from Rockefeller sweeping across, everybody.
Can I answer now?
But in other words, producers.
Because you're already mischaracterizing the Interstate Commerce Act.
Well,
okay, which I went to the original source documents.
We may have disagreement about that, but certainly a lot of these acts, my point is they're there to protect producers.
No.
Not. Well, that was the
That's not the
Inspection
Cullum
Act.
report. When you see the Cullum report, which is the predecessor Senate committee that underlied the Interstate Commerce Act.
No, I'm not saying the Interstate Commerce Act. I'm saying the Meat Inspection Act, the Sherman Act.
No, I'm talking about the Interstate Commerce Act.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a different thing. But that was redistributed.
That's the origin of statutory common carriage.
Yes, but I'm saying to address Ken's point about when you think about monopoly and its purposes, it has been used in the guise to protect inefficient small producers frequently, and then with a statement that it is for consumers, and I'm saying that's not factually accurate. There's a large literature in economic history.
Okay, here's the problem.
Looking at those various acts.
Here's part of what's difficult for me. First of all, I've already published a book based on my dissertation, which recounts a lot of these bodies of law. What's happened in the last 20 years is there's so many more pieces of the puzzle. This is why I actually have a book prospectus into MIT Press. Because it's impossible. I've gotten to the point where it's impossible in a given article. It's like I can't recapture all the rest of everything else that underlies why I asked this particular question. This particular question is an extension over a much bigger body of work. So you're exactly right. If you saw the other body of work, would provide the context. That's one of the challenges and why I decided I have to do the book. So that's so that will help set the bigger context. You're exactly right. What the bigger context is that if we think in terms of complexity theory, okay, different institutions evolve, bodies of law evolve, and they evolve in response to different forces that are in play, okay, in the economy, in governance, whether it's political, legal. The legal principles that have evolved to deal with certain kinds of problems. Common carriage and public utility are two types of common law, bodies of law that emerged and evolved over centuries, okay, to address certain kinds of problems. The origins of being a common carrier had nothing to do with monopoly. Absolutely nothing. What it meant to be a common carrier is the type of service you provide. And basically what makes you a common carrier, the notion that you take something that belongs to somebody else and you just are a conduit. That's all you do. And over and under the common law, certain obligations arose under tort law, which is the oldest form of common law, that simply imposed certain duties on you if you decided to engage in the business of transporting something that belonged to somebody else. And that's the origin. So it's important to understand it took centuries, and the origins of this law for our country come from the British common law and have survived centuries of evolution of the evolution of our society. What happened was once we hit the 19th century, back with the original common carriers, they didn't have to build their own infrastructure. The roads were already there. The rivers were already there. Okay? What happened in the 19th century as technological innovation evolved, new types of common carriage evolved, which also technologically required a new infrastructure to be built to carry it over. Railroads, telegraph, telephone. The emergence of public utility law was a separate body of law to deal with the problem of, and how do you get the infrastructure built? Okay? So some of these entities were both common carriers because all they were a conduit, and then they acquired a public utility status because government gave them a franchise and actually gave them like eminent domain, access to rights of way, and actually delegated to them those powers that normally belong to the sovereign to enable them to build the infrastructure to then provide the service over. So now these entities have a dual classification, but for totally different reasons. They're common carriers and they're public utilities, but for two totally different reasons. What happened in the late 19th century, the correct understanding of the Interstate Commerce Act was it turned out that the common law version of common carriage was not adequate enough to protect consumers. Because to protect people or to enforce the duties of a common carrier, the only option was you had to go to court. You sue the railroad in this case, and you go to court. And what happened was the railroads had such dominance in the courts. You know, they had the resources to stall, they had the information that the poor customer needed to prove their case. A customer continued to be vulnerable to the railroads while they sued them. There are all sorts of reasons why judicial litigation wasn't doing it. On top of it, the railroads were building into interstate commerce, and under our Constitution, the states had no jurisdiction. So if you're going to regulate interstate commerce, only Congress can do that. Okay? That's where the pressure was building for Congress to do something. What's really interesting, however, is this late 19th century is also the rise of the growth of corporations throughout the 19th century, the rise of them in other kinds of technology, economies of scale. And what happened was they started developing trusts to get around laws. And so what happened was when the Congress was looking what to do about the railroads, when you look at the Cullum report, named after Senator Cullum, which is a special committee of Congress, or the Senate, was established to look at this problem. They put in their own report, in italics, they emphasize, the core problem is the rise of corporate power, period. They say, at this time, it's rise of corporate power. And in this particular case, they were only going to look at a subset of corporations, those in transportation, and in particularly those of railroads, because they're so critical to commerce. And their own metaphor was, railroads were the arteries through which railroads are the lifeblood through which flows railroads provide the arteries that are the lifeblood for commerce. Okay? So, given the lack of states' jurisdiction in interstate commerce, given the lack of, or the inadequacy of common law remedies, given, and they specifically said that, given the inability of competition alone to protect consumers, because monopoly was not the problem, Congress finally passed a statute to regulate railroads. And that's the Interstate Commerce Act. And what they decided was, since judicial litigation wasn't going to work, this is the beginning, this is the very first federal agency that was ever created to regulate interstate commerce. Period. And they created the Interstate Commerce Commission, They copied from the states. Some states had already created their own commissions to regulate in intrastate commerce, and Congress decided that's a good idea. Let's do that at the federal level. So the whole purpose of that act was to address the problem of corporate power, and particularly in a sector that was so critical to commerce and such a critical infrastructure that affected everybody. That's the true origins of this act. And what I'm saying is, to your point, you're exactly right. I'm sorry, I went a little long-winded, but that's what's in the bigger picture. When you understand that, all those concerns still exist today. They are all still relevant today for these infrastructures. The same problems. What they did was they simply codified the common law obligations of common carriers, but they put a new enforcement mechanism in. And the enforcement mechanism switched from being the poor little customer having to go to court to have a federal agency that's now going to oversee this. And now they are the ones that determine what rates are reasonable or not. So on and so forth. And so the whole reason why they put an agency in power was actually to help mediate the corporate power problem, because customers can't face up to these big corporations with these key infrastructures.
But they took from some customers and gave to others, is my point. So I agree with you. The whole litigation of all these acts in this period was the same language was used in the Sherman Antitrust Act. If we would not submit to a king, we can't submit to, and this is Sherman talking in this grandiose language, we can't submit to the dictatorial power of kings of commerce and so on. But it was they were more concerned about driving small businessmen out, and the way that
the Antitrust Act is a separate body of law.
No, but I'm saying it was all part of the same rhetoric about monopoly power and corporate power. That
corporate power is not the same as monopoly power.
I understand from an economic
this is
point
where
of
again
view.
they keep putting
But that's actually what I was trying to get.
Corporate power and monopoly power are not the same.
They frequently use those two terms in these acts.
When you look in the column report, they don't talk monopoly.
No, but that's only the column report. I'm saying it's
no. Well, this is what
larger.
This is what I'm trying to emphasize, though. Before you had the Sherman Act, you already had under the law
absolutely
entities that had a very special legal status, common carriers and public utilities. And so when they decide to deal with the corporate power problem in those specific legal statuses, they created statutory versions of those special legal statuses. And it's a form of industry-specific regulation. So industry-specific regulation of providers of these key infrastructures go back centuries and they are different from the general business sector. So you have to understand, why did they acquire these special legal statuses? That's where you go back to some of the key just price doctrine. There's all these other kinds of doctrines that underlie. But when you understand the lineage of the law, which I know I'm kind of boring people, I do in other writings. This is just a piece of a bigger puzzle. What you understand is that over time, different legal status have evolved to reflect a certain kind of problem. What I've also found when I do international comparisons is that in other societies, they also develop special legal statuses for these entities. What we find is, for example, when you look at, to your point, when you look at the importance of the rule of law, as they say, when we talk about Douglas North, okay, Stiglitz, the importance of the rule of law to economics. And therefore the importance of having some general bodies of law that deal with things such as property or contract law. What we find is those bodies of law are not sufficient. There's another set of bodies of law that keep getting evolved to deal with special legal status of certain kinds of entities. Common carriage is what's called in the United States, and public utility. In other countries, they also develop their own bodies of law that deal with these structures differently from just any general business. The Antitrust Statute came later, 3 years later, and that was to attempt to deal with some of the problems in general business, what we would call general business legislation. And it turns out common carriers and public utilities were subject not only to their industry-specific regulation, but also to the antitrust. So it was cumulative. But the reasons why you had common carriers and public utilities were to deal with very specific kinds of problems in the economy that had to do with relationships between a provider of certain kinds of services that are considered so essential and the relation to the public. that special legal principles evolved to apply to them. And that what's happened is throughout the late 19th and 20th century, we built on that. We took the common law principles, we built on them, and did ever more sophisticated statutory versions. And where things have really flipped is that starting around 2000, 2002 in the United States, we went to this big deregulatory thing where now we actually stripped the equivalent of that key legal status for the first time ever. When we did quote-unquote deregulation of transportation, like railroads or airlines, they never lost their legal status as common carriers, even to this day. They're still common carriers. All we did was tinker with the statutory superstructure that was built off on top of the common law foundation. What's so different about telecom is when the FCC came out with some orders in 2002, we did the equivalent of stripping. Not only, we didn't just tinker with the statutory, we stripped a whole status away from them. It was never done before in the history of the United States. We never took something before that had been a common carrier and declassified it. That's what's so radical when you really understand the history. And it's this confusion and this rhetoric here has contributed to why that's gotten traction in the United States. You go across the border to Canada with the same legal history, they've never declassified broadband from being common carriage. They didn't take this weird route that we went, which is why part of it spurred me to say, why didn't it? And it turns out there's something unique about their history combined with, but what I was trying to strip down to, and you're exactly right, and this is why it's been so hard. I need to have the whole book for the foundation to know where this piece fits in. Where this piece is trying to fit in is why is it that I'm finding, every time I try to talk to economists in the United States, when I tell them this is what a public utility means legally, they try and tell me I'm wrong, and they're not lawyers. The resistance is so intense, I can't even get them to say, look, wait a minute, a legal meaning is a different meaning. And it's like, they don't want to hear it. That's kind of what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to get these two disciplines to talk to each other. And what it means to be a public utility and a lawyer in a legal sense, and is how the laws are written, and is sets what they can or cannot do. It does matter. I'm sorry, I went on and on. Go ahead.
So we've got a queue. Gustavo, David,
Yeah.
Dean.
But you're right, the richer context is essential, and I just can't totally repeat it here.
Gustavo.
Okay, so I have maybe a very basic and probably silly question. It's, what's the problem with corporate power when you have competition? I understand the difference between corporate power and monopoly power, but what are the problems of corporate power when you have competition?
I'll give you a classic example. The problem with corporate power is, for example, when you have these, we'll use in the context of carriers. These carriers now are very large companies. Take your cell phone company. Take your phone. You want to get a carrier, they offer you a contract, sign it, take it or leave it. You can't negotiate the terms. Okay? What do they put in those contracts? What they put in these contracts, they're called legally contracts of adhesion. Contract of adhesion are standardized contracts where the provider has all the power and you just have to take the terms or you don't get the service, period. Okay? What's happened is these contracts of adhesion are an example, and this happens even if you have, let's say with the cellular companies, let's say you have 4 major cellular companies, which tends to be the case in the United States. This is another thing we found as a matter of economics. The carriers don't compete on all the terms. There are certain terms and conditions that they all then adopt. They all have these mandatory arbitration clauses, mandatory waive your rights to class action lawsuits.
We go back to market power. That's a problem of market power.
It's market power, it's not monopoly.
Well, when the
No,
economists
this is
talk
very
about
common
monopoly,
in
they talk
oligopoly. There's a
general
whole
market
rich
power.
empirical evidence that shows that this happens whenever the providers are large relative to the customer. Now, it turns out if you happen to be a large corporate customer, okay, sometimes you have enough bargaining power to actually negotiate different terms. But in mass markets, for the most part, customers in a mass market do not have the ability to negotiate better terms with the providers, even if there's multiple providers, because the providers themselves, it's not a form of actual collusion. They just, what evolves in the market is that they end up developing terms that are favorable to them. The only legal principle to strike that down is something we call unconscionability. They have to be so egregious that under the law there is something you call an unconscionability doctrine. But it's getting harder and harder to get that. And why? Because AT&T just won a lawsuit against affirmed by the Supreme Court now, where they can require you to submit to arbitration agreements. You have to waive all your rights to go to court, period.
I understand, but it looked like now we are talking about, it's a question of a little bit of labels, because I think that modern economists working on industrial organization will consider all those things ways of exercising market power. So essentially,
So
it's
monopoly is
within
just a
the
special
standard
case.
economic theory.
Yes, but what
Tacit
makes you a
collusion
common
is-
carrier and what makes you public utility has nothing to do with that.
Totally agree with you.
Yeah, right.
Totally
But
agree
you
with
see, the economists have waited, via Khan in particular, have affected the debate on regulation, so they get people to think, oh, if you're not a monopolist, you don't need to be labeled, you shouldn't have to be regulated as a common carrier or public utility, because those only apply to natural monopolies. That's what's been happening in the
But that's
telecom
very
debates.
single-minded economists that
Yeah.
believe there's monopoly or perfect competition, that all the action in economic theory on industrial organization is now in the middle.
Right.
That's not what I'm trying to explain to you is what's happening in the telecom policy debates.
And I believe you. So
And
I
they
know
cite
that
Khan.
it's-
This is why I went to Khan.
But this
because
could
they
be
cite
political
Khan as
strategy, no?
justification.
It's like, it could be a political strategy in the following sense. Instead of discussing what is in the middle in a smart way, I give you a take it or leave it offer in the political terms. So now that if you can be perfect competition or natural monopoly, and you are a very strong oligopoly, I have to classify you maybe as competition, and then I do not regulate you, no? But I think that's, from my point of view, is more a political bias rather than a bias coming from the theory. The theory, all the action in the theory is in those middle cases right now.
This is why we have to get it down to schools of thought within. What I'm trying to say is that within the field of economics, those scholars who view themselves as regulatory economists, who then get retained by companies, things like Represented, this is the story they tell.
Yes.
And it's been almost impossible to rebut.
Yeah.
Because by definition, we are not getting the economists who are not espousing this to weigh in. This is part of what I'm trying to get your help with. I'm trying to figure out why is that, and it turns out that part of the problem is that Khan's vocabulary conflates
Right.
what and you see the most lawyers aren't good enough to catch it, okay? And it turns out it's not just because they don't know economics, but because there's been confusion within our own jurisprudence. So what we have is an accumulation of errors. That's what I was trying to say here. We have an accumulation of distortions, and what I'm finding is next to impossible to unravel them so that we can get down to, let's talk about what's really going on. So all I can tell you is, at least within the school that call themselves regulatory economists, I welcome the idea of other economists telling the regulatory economists, you got it wrong. Please help. You know, I
May I
mean,
add one thing?
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
that there is one problem that traditionally regulation of public utilities or natural monopoly theory ended up within public economics or public finance in economics, while the issues about market power stay within industrial organization.
Right.
And that's, from my point of view, push a lot on the division of this. Well, public economics only treats extreme cases, natural monopoly,
Right.
and then the other cases are treated by people doing industrial organization. But my belief that
see,
right now,
I'm familiar with industrial organization. When I was doing my joint degree program at Harvard, that
Yes.
was industrial organization. So you're saying that people, and so I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah,
What I'm saying is those, however, that are following more of this Khan school of thought, you're saying it shows up more where now?
I think they are essentially more within public economics or public finance. So within public finance, you have taxation, public goods, and one traditional topic is regulation of natural monopoly. But they never open a standard textbook on public economics, and usually they do not cover oligopoly, regulation of oligopoly, other ways of market power. And that's probably put a lot of bias on these two.
Yeah, and well, the thing that I'm finding, and this is helpful for me, the thing I'm finding troubling is like Tom Hazlett, well, the same buddy, Tom Hazlett, he's at George Mason now. PhD trained, straight up,
Tom.
communist.
It's kind of up there.
That's his dissertation. So I've known him for years. Okay, and we had talks. And we had kind of like a blow up, about a couple months ago, because I said, Tom, you got it wrong. It's like there are PhD economists who are in economics departments who will pull themselves out to opine on regulatory policy for telecom, and this is the story they tell. This is the story they tell. So how do we rebut that? That's what I need help with.
Well, because there's a whole, Gustavo was saying, and then get to David and Dean, there is a whole group of IO guys out there who talk about tacit collusion, who talk about the
Yes.
variety of mechanisms of market power. You know, it goes to roll. There's a whole
Yes, I'm
literature
familiar
out
about
there.
that.
So I think Hazlitt's at the extreme version of if you have more than one, then it's not a monopoly. So end
Yes.
of debate. Consumers aren't getting screwed. So
Yeah, and he is
Yeah.
more one.
So
and the
he would
contestable
be-
market theory, I think that push things in that direction, which
Yeah.
my point of view, it's wrong. No?
Yes,
It's
I agree.
Is this where the Chicago schools kind of?
contestable
Or
market,
at least
where the
parts
IO
of it.
contestable
No,
market.
Chicago School.
Bell, within the Bell Corporation, they developed Baumol, Panzer, Willig.
Right.
This idea, as soon as you have another guy that
Well, and we
willing
did the
to enter,
contestable markets thing.
Yeah.
yes, and that also pushed this
Yes.
theoretical direction is like either
Yes.
you have a full monopoly, or as soon as there is a little bit of contestability of the market, you go to something that looks pretty much perfect competition. But I think in general, the IO, well, you are the IO person.
Within telecom
It's the same
debates, all I can tell you is there's this whole
they will not
cadre,
agree
like
that that's a
this.
good
Will it?
representation of
I
reality.
know, but I know Panzer, you know,
Yeah.
I met Baumel, I mean, all that. I know these, at least in the policy debates that have to do with governance of telecommunications, this particular view has incredible weight.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm trying to find is a way to push back. So this was just an analytical curiosity I had to figure out where did this come from. But in terms of the reality, you know, why some of this got this idea, and this is where some of this confusion between the law and the economics is a piece of the puzzle. So I was just curious about that here. But how it's manifesting itself today, how the field is today, how departments are structured and things like that. You know, I kind of maybe I've lost track about who tends to be where or where there might be room to. Basically, what I'm trying to say is these are the legal principles. These are the reasons why these principles
Right.
evolved. And if you understand the true underlying reasons, what you'll find is a lot of these reasons still exist, and they don't magically go away. They're not going to magically go away. And number two, you don't have to have a natural monopoly for the problems to be there.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to get at. So how do we make penetrate?
David, Jim.
I'm sorry.
So are we mostly talking about cases that when you're talking about what the economists are saying, these are generally cases where these are expert witnesses being called?
No, more likely they're writing research papers to support AT&T, CenturyLink, Comcast, these kinds of things. It's not even litigated. I mean, that's what makes this so dangerous.
Or
You see?
advisors to the organization, hired specifically
Yes.
within, and that's their
Yeah, but
Yes, and then they
Person
submit
really
these
working
research
for them.
papers to the
Yeah.
FCC. You see,
Think about it.
unlike Canada that had to
Think about
litigate
where their
because they don't-
incentives are.
I know.
Well,
But we're not, but no, here's the thing. I don't know how do I engender a voice to counter it. I certainly understand their personal incentives to do it. And I know the personal incentives of some lawyers who keep espousing certain things even after they're corrected about it, okay? And they keep doing it because it's for money. The problem is there's a lot at stake here right now because of what's happening in Washington. What's happening in Washington is, first of all, it took 15 years to get this turned around, to get this reclassification reinstated. And now, even if it's upheld by the courts, depending upon, you know, Congress or the Republican Congress that are being urged on by these people through all their research papers, I will tell you, if we have a Republican in the White House right now, you can kiss net neutrality goodbye. Because they're going to pass a law to eliminate the common carriage and public utility status again. And all these protections that evolved all these years, they're going to be gone. That's why it matters. That's why I care. And so what I'm saying is, I know they're personal, but how do we get voices heard to help push the other way?
So I think that's
And maybe
where
by people that are do credible within the field, you know.
I think that's where I come in on this. So I'm approaching this from a law, policy, social science, political science kind of background that includes practice.
Yeah.
And I feel your pain on this. I see it happen too in other places. And one of the ways that I have seen that kind of issue come is on the cyber debates, right?
Yes.
Because when we start to think about the same kind of infrastructure, and set aside the specifics of net neutrality, broadband, et cetera, you have to go back to a 1917 law that first talks about, right past in these early eras, that
Yes.
talks about the role of government in security circumstances, in wartime, et cetera. that clogs the debate. Misunderstanding about the circumstances and how things might have played out then is very important to how we have the debate about where the laws might go down the road. I will stay agnostic on theological debates of economics for sure. I guess where I saw this as particularly helpful is it seems to be a roadmap, even more so than other papers I've read through the workshop. It seems to be your roadmap for the communities that have to come together and offer not just your view of this with a couple of helpful critiques to kind of paint the landscape, but then also move into anthropology, sociology, history, to bring those competing chapters together to then drive the additional thinking. So I'm interested in asking you to go the next step about how you think what are the 5 or 6 disciplines that have to come together to analyze this from several different perspectives and come out with that next book. Right? To me, that's what's going to influence people. That's going to sit on somebody's shelf and say, I can't access the economics debates or the history of the way that the law evolved, but I can access the sociology argument. That makes sense to me, right? And one of the ways that this comes together for me is through David Hawken over in informatics, who's dealing with anthropology, social informatics. It's trying to understand how we value information in the future. Right? And he's thinking long term, and his colleagues are thinking long term about the post-state societies that we may have, the governance issues that are involved in that. You don't get there without being able to have this kind of discussion with the same language. So I think there's real value in that, right? To use that term and look at the processes. And I think it would be helpful to define the groups that you want to see come together, to put those competing viewpoints together, and define the project that makes it happen.
Yeah, a lot of different people at the table. You would need lawyers at the table, and you would need economists at the table. You would need sociologists. Sociologists have been very helpful to help explain the lineage of the law. The lineage of the coevolution of the economic sector with the U.S. All these have to be informed by a good, healthy historical perspective. And an important segment has to do with the political science course. I just realized I hadn't mentioned that. The way I look at it is that we have a lot of all these different institutions that humans have created to govern social activities are all themselves complex systems, and they co-evolve and adapt to each other. The law evolves and adapts to deal with changes in technology, changes in the economy, changes in culture, okay? And so they're all embedded and intertwined. And you have to have, there's this feedback loop that goes back between, we evolve new technology that creates new economic possibilities, which then creates new social consequences, and then often a demand for government to do something about it. And Deborah Spar has written a book called Ruling the Waves that explains that. I think the lack of sufficient historical perspective to understand that where we are today is a result of centuries, if not millennia, of experimentation with governance structures. So that if you strip something away, you need to have a more historical perspective to understand what it might do to the system. Okay, what would happen to your economy if you stripped property rights? What would happen to an economic system if there were no enforceable contract rights? Well, it turns out, and I've been in this number of decades, it turns out special bodies of law have evolved to deal with availability of key network infrastructures. And this is where the bridge, I find, with Oster workshop, generally. It's just there's some special bodies of law that dealt when they were new technologies that required these new infrastructures to be built that were economies of scale, right? Network effects, all these kinds of things. And we've developed bodies of law to address them. And in this more recent era of deregulation, it's as if we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's a lot what the book I'm working on is about, is to bring those together.
So, Barbara, is it possible that one of the difficulties you're having is in a 10-step process, you're starting at step 7 in terms of trying to communicate?
Yes. You're so right. This is why the last couple of years I haven't published many articles, because what was happening, as you can even see here, it's part of a bigger body of work, and then it becomes self-referential, right? Well, then I have to quote to when I did this, this, and this, and this, and it's too much.
You're right. So.
And I finally had to put it in one place, which is why I have a colleague who's been very patient. It took longer than I thought. It's taken me 3 years because the net neutrality debate interrupted. It took me 3 years and my sabbatical last spring to finally get the book prospectus in. Where I'm trying to do is lay this whole foundation so that by the time you get to this might be like step 12, after all of this. And this has been part of, and thank you you've been so tolerant. Thank you for your advice here. But this has been part of my frustration is that it's almost like you had to know all this other stuff to even know that this is a question, you know what I'm saying? Why does this question even matter? Well, it's because of all this stuff I've done before that led me to it. And how do you, and I guess as a scholar, because I came to the academia later too, here's the thing. How do you, maybe I'm just asking also as scholars, how do you do this? I mean, I essentially in this book, I'm trying to recover like about 20 years of research that actually is further informed by 15 years of industry experience before that. So this is like my trying to put out a whole life's thing, and it's almost like you have to see all that to even know why does this matter. All I can tell you is today, where we're at today, we are at a juncture of some very important legal decisions. Okay? And while we have a gridlocked Congress, more and more is being decided by the courts. This is well documented by lawyers and political scientists. A lot of key decisions are coming through the courts instead of Congress because we can't get stuff through. And this is where some of the progress has been made by these large corporations through litigation. The contracts have adhesion that I mentioned earlier for centuries. Well, there's been common law of contract. For over a century, there's been a special recognition of a category called contracts of adhesion, okay? And there are special doctrines called unconscionability that evolved to protect them. AT&T Mobility, the cell phone company, brought a case to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was accepted by the U.S. Supreme Court just a couple of years ago, and the Supreme Court overruled essentially all sorts of precedent and had a radical interpretation of a Federal Arbitration Act to say now all the consumer protection laws in the states, all the state contract laws, you now have no right to go there. These companies now can put in their contracts mandatory arbitration clause, mandatory class action waivers. You have now lost literally your constitutional right to go to court. And it was an extreme interpretation by Supreme Court, 5-4. Okay? This is the same 5-4 that gave us Citizens United that says corporations have the same speech rights as people. And this is what's happening. And this is why I'm saying it's important, because we are getting important decisions coming out of this court that are realigning the power and even the remedies that people have. So what's happened here is the whole common carriage public utility debate is just another symptom of that same problem where these companies, and I know because I used to work for them, their goal was to get declassified from common carriage and public utility if they can, so they can decide, all these traditional laws don't apply, and they can decide who they're going to serve, where they're going to serve, when, under what terms and conditions, and the government's going to have absolutely no say over it, and customers can't even go to court to challenge. That's why I care.
So a quick follow-up on that. As you continue to think about that, I've talked to a number of psychologists who are doing psychology and law issues, right? We're looking at public legitimacy. And from one perspective, to borrow from that field, right, there's no accepted right or wrong in terms of the outcomes you just described. They all might be legitimate in some way, unless we can narrow it down to some organically, truthful thing that has to be known. So I think the public perception, the perception of the courts and the legislatures of what they're doing, why they're doing, et cetera, may be right for a lot of different reasons, regardless whether it's historically accurate or consistent with one vein of economic analysis. I think the challenge for you is to find that legitimate part of things. You want to find where these institutions are effective and legitimate on these kinds of issues. At least that's how I'm perceiving this paper through this discussion.
Yes, what I'm trying to make sure is that, I guess it's a way of trying to address power in all its different various. What's happening is the rise of corporate power even through the 19th century, they only got to this point because the states start changing laws to enable corporations to be established much more easily. And so what's happened is we've allowed, it's like the equivalent of a new tribe. We've allowed, through this legal entity we call corporations, we've now allowed collectivities of people to exercise power in a way that undermines the ability of individuals. And so what happens, this contracts of adhesion is just an example now. The corporations have now been able to achieve through litigation what they couldn't get through legislation. Okay? And, but this is part where the bigger book is going to be about. I'm sorry I didn't belabor it. But the fact is we've got very important policy debates today. What all I'm trying to contribute is an informed, accurate understanding of these principles so we can actually have a discussion on the merits, on the facts, as opposed to it being just the emergent outcome of who could lobby more effectively than somebody else, who has the deeper pockets to go and pick and choose, whether they're the extreme economists or whatever, to write what they want to write so they can actually skew the debate so that people don't actually get a debate on what it's really all about. And even the FCC is at fault in this, in that they don't have hearings anymore. The reason why this false monopoly theory argument got rejected in Canada is the commission up there, the equivalent of the FCC, which is the CRTC, actually had a litigated proceeding. Okay? People could hire their experts. The consumer groups, the Public Interest Advocacy Center, retained me as an expert witness. My legal opinion went up against the top legal opinion lawyers up there, and the commission, because of litigated merits, the commission agreed with me. And it was the only reason, that was the only way we could get it, because it actually was, as you mentioned earlier, it was only because there actually was expert testimony and actually litigated. What's happening in Washington now, in reality, at the FCC and on the Hill, it's all lobbying. They don't have hearings anymore. The FCC doesn't have hearings anymore. It's all paper pleadings.
So Dean, you wanted to get in on this?
Yeah, a couple things. One, I mean, you're really asserting that this political rhetoric about whether you're using these terms certain ways actually matters, and
Yes.
you don't test that. I'm not sure how you would. And this goes really back to Ken's question. I mean, this has always been true. That I mean, some of the discussion around the Sherman Act was people were making various claims, and it's sort of the role of social scientists to sort of deconstruct this after the fact. So I'm not so sure that you're just asserting that all this rhetoric has really important empirical outcomes, and I'm not sure that it does, and what you think about how you test it. I also find your discussion of public utilities a little bit limiting, really. I mean, you only cite Kahn, which is a long time ago. You didn't cite Demsitz or Stigler or other people who sort of talk about the sort of political economy and property rights issues over utilities, and more modern work on. When I think of public utilities, I'm thinking of water companies and electric companies and so forth. And there's been a lot of work on when you get public involvement in producing these things. And so I thought the discussion of public utility and national monopoly was a little limiting. And you know, by the same along the same line, the common carrier is really a network, I think, phenomenon, and that has very similar decreasing cost characteristics to what we typically think of as a national monopoly, and does link to these discussions of water companies, electrical companies, and so forth. And I do this very quickly, so I apologize, but my sense is you want to dismiss that. You want to dismiss that linkage, and there's linkage there, I think, that should be discussed rather than. I guess I thought there was too much going back to what Kahn said stuff.
Oh, that's because the only purpose of this paper was very narrow. The only purpose of this paper was I was trying to see if I could home in on where the origins of a lot of the confusion between economists. You're right. That this is just my first. I was trying to see if I could figure out where is it coming from that at least those. How do I say this? If you're in the telecom debates or circles, and you're exactly right, it's very well known. Let's just put it this way: in the telecom debates, how when you look at the lineage of regulation of telecom, it goes back over a century. Okay. Common carriage, public utility, all these other kinds of things. the deregulatory eras where a lot of things are, which are counted since the last several decades, are considered this period where there's this confusion now about what things are and what their statuses are. And this is where there's a lot of rhetoric because there's a lot of money at stake, representing things as one thing or another. I was only focusing on common because I was trying to look for, was there kind of an original nub of where this was? So it was very, very narrow in that sense. In terms of the public utility, there's many other writings that I've done. And of course, you guys don't know that. But there's many other writings. For example, there's many different types. There's common carriers, there's public utilities. Some are one, some are the other, and some are both. Okay? And what makes things tricky and why there can be confusion is that telecom companies and railroads have been both. Okay? Public utility has to do with the granting of a franchise period. And it could be for water, it could be for gas, it could be for electric, whatever, these kind of things. But they're not common carriers. Those are not common carriers. Okay? And what the debate was in Washington over net neutrality is whether or not broadband is a common carriage service. That's what the federal statute issue was about. So when people kept trying to throw in public utility, that's actually irrelevant. What makes you a public utility is a matter of state law. And it's a different body of law. It's got nothing to do with being a common carrier.
I
And
didn't get
so
that clarification in the paper, though. I mean, that's...
I guess I apologize because again I've written so extensively on this in so many other places, and that's why I'm saying I can't do just an article here.
The
Yes.
paper seems to have kind of two. It has this the current telecom debate stuff going on, and then this history of public utility law. But then I guess they don't seem as linked to me. And public utility law, as you just pointed out, is a lot of state law.
Yes, it's
And
its
so,
origins of
I mean,
state law.
that's where it seems like it doesn't quite all fit.
Yeah, so I have to
for
say
me.
I really want to thank you guys for being patient in reading this because this is like a sliver in a much bigger body of work. And what's always been challenging for me now is how much do I repeat from the other stuff in order to lay the bigger context to understand this. And so your feedback is very helpful that and that's why I got to do the bigger format. But yeah, these two bodies of law, common carriage, that you're one or the other or both. It turns out this was just like a teeny sliver of a much bigger body. It's like a piece of mosaic in a much bigger puzzle.
I think
And so I've got to lay a better, if I want to talk to other people this, I've got to find a different way of laying the bigger context so it even makes sense what I'm trying to explain or what I'm looking at.
Well, yeah, and I think Ken's point in the beginning was really spot on. That you're conflating where you want policy to go with also this history of legal evolution because of our common law heritage. So of course that's going to evolve. And then for a variety of reasons, certain things in economics come in and out of vogue. And one of them was, which Con was really responding to, was that the problem with all these regulatory agencies is they got captured. The railroads got captured by, instead of regulating, they were regulating for the railroads now.
Yes.
And so they weren't pro-consumer. And so these things do come in waves. But meanwhile, within economics, there's a very nuanced literature going on out there that isn't terribly engaged with policy, what it will be, but really just with the industrial organization and market power, and then a variety of taxes, subsidies, regulation. And you don't mention Coase, of course, who was heavily involved with this from a pure property rights perspective. So I do think, though, separating out the economics of the issues and then the legal side of how you get to where you'd like to have optimal policy. And David's point, I think, is really important, of to capture and I remember when they deregulated airlines and so on, that you really had to market this and structure it in a legitimate fashion. Legitimacy really matters. And if you ask people, well, who's more legitimate right now, the courts or Congress? Well, they're both about as illegitimately viewed by the population as, I won't say, But
As economists.
as economists, exactly, as economists who pay for hire. So,
Well, you're exactly right, and that's why in the book that I'm doing, I'm actually looking at the whole U.S. governance system as a system with all these moving parts.
that I think would be.
And that's what it is about. And so this was like a smaller piece. Well, I have to admit, I was asked kind of last minute if I would step in, and this was the latest working paper I had. So I apologize that I didn't have the chance to rework part of it, maybe to at least put the bigger the context. But there's a lot of moving parts here. But I appreciate your patience in working through this. So I guess that's also the challenge of jumping back and forth between the real world and trying to be involved in debates and then trying to research things back here and in different fields and get them all integrated. So I feel like Sybil sometimes. With which personality am I bringing out today? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.